sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I am joined by Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa, for our supporters exclusive midweek ideologies show. Justin, welcome to Religion as an Ideology.
It's good to be here and to be exclusive.
If you think about it, we are exclusive. No, I guess I'm not exclusive because I flutter between you and Ken.
You're promiscuous.
No, I think I'm polyamorous is what I am.
Right,
I'm exclusive to two.
You have my consent to podcast with Ken. So yeah, I think that's
exactly.
That's
See, it all works out.
Promiscuous.
And that's the key, friends. You've got to have consent in advance.
I never thought I'd be in a polycue with you and Ken.
But it makes sense on some level because, he likes to do the music. If we all lived closer together, I can imagine us going out to a concert together and having a good time before, during, and after, right? I can just feel that. I think the only difference would be he would pick something far more obscure than the two of us would generally pick. So he would have to come along.
I could go pretty bad.
He has some things where I just think, where did that come from? But anyway,
I had
so
to
there you
explain
go.
guar to my partner the other day. So
okay, that's funny. That's funny. But before we get too deep down, because this is not a music podcast, this is a politics podcast.
It is not.
I want to remind everybody that the time is quickly approaching. The end of July is almost here. And as you probably know by this point, you've heard from myself, you've heard from Mike, you know that during July, we're running a special where you can either get a discount at 90% off your first month. Again, we'd make it free, but Patreon doesn't let for that. Or 10% off for yearly supporters. And here's the big go. If we get 25 people to either become a new supporter or to increase their level of support, and by doing that, getting that special discount, we will commit to making some video podcast episodes. And that's going to be a lot of fun. As a matter of fact, Justin and I have been talking about funny ways we might approach that, fun ways we might approach that, serious ways we might approach that. So to make that happen, though, we need 25. And that means you are in the final week of that ability. So please, if you haven't already, head down to the show notes, take a look at the two QR codes. It's 0943D and 9B50C. You don't have to remember them. Just head down to the show notes, click there on Patreon, put in the code, and you'll be getting your 10% off for the whole year on top of you're already getting a discount, or you're getting a nearly free first month. So again, 1 week left in July to see if we hit those 25, and I'm excited to see what happens on that front. But let's get to the show. So, Justin, we've been going through for almost a year now, political ideologies. And to be frank with everybody, what we've been doing, we've more or less followed the overall framework of a class that I teach on contemporary political ideologies at Oklahoma Christian University. And it's a lot of fun. And we've hit what we think of as being the classical ideologies. Then we took a look at the response to those, the more modern or contemporary ideologies, and how they react to those classical ideologies, and they shift over time. So one of the things that makes my university unique, and in my case, wonderful, I love this, is we're a Kingdom University. And what that means is that we're broadly Christian. We recognize kind of a framework. Doesn't mean all of our students are. We don't demand anybody be a Christian to come to OC, but it orients the way we think about things. And so one of the things that I like to do, and that we're going to actually tackle this week together, Justin and myself, we're going to take a look at religion as a political ideology. Religion is a political ideology. And usually we do this in my classes because when I say poke, I think sometimes that might get the wrong connotation. I want to get people out of their comfort zone. I want them to think a little more critically about what the implications of the positions they have and what it means. And this can throw people a little bit because they oftentimes put politics in one particular box, they put religion in another particular box. And there are systems in which that could happen, right? So religion can be a private faith system, but usually it often includes an extension where the texts of your religion, the authority of your religion get translated into political power and to law. And part of that happens because, as we talked about early on, ideologies have end goals for what ought to be happening. There is a sense of the good that you're trying to get to and you're trying to achieve. And religions can have that as well. And they can also be not just a pie in the sky and the great by and by. They can also be things happening here and happening now. And so when we kind of apply those concepts of ideology to religion, right, they oftentimes have a critique of existing society of some way. They often have that vision of the good society for the here and now. And there can be strategies for getting there. And so instead of just kind of being more narrow-minded on just Christianity, I think what we're going to be doing today is we're going to kind of look through and think about religion a little bit more broadly and how it becomes, thinks about, and is ideological. Now, I know, Justin, we're starting probably getting a little further afield of the things that you probably teach a class on that front. Do you mean
we're going to give next time to me? So
yeah, it isn't going to be all you, but you'd look more at the behavioral side of things,
yes,
of course, and we haven't actually talked about this. So, is religious identity one of those elements that you examine in the behavioral side of things? I wanted to start with that question.
Yeah, it pops up, and certainly if we think about religion as a political force, if I can indulge me in a 2-minute walk through the history of American political behavior research.
That's what we're here for.
Kind of the earliest sort of research on voters didn't have individual level data. So basically they would compare, kind of the best you could do is compare precincts, and then you could map demographics onto that. And certainly one that popped up very early on was religion. That was something that you could get a sense of, okay, this is this kind of neighborhood and this is that kind of neighborhood. And so you could get things. I mean, really about all you could pull out of that was income, religion, and maybe ethnicity, were sort of so. And I think, the things that came out of that were broadly right, but the big divide was largely sort of between Protestants and Catholics, and you have a very strong, divide there, kind of in those early days. And the sense in which it was talked about was not so much ideological as more of a sort of, group dynamics sort of thing, or a coalition sort of thing. The story was sort of that, because in this era, a lot of Catholics were, we're talking 30s, 40s, 50s, a lot of Catholics were not that many generations removed from being immigrants. And so,
right. And that would also have been the dividing period where they would have been what we think of as being pro-life-ish advocates, where Protestants more generally were not.
Right. So, so the story anyway is, and frankly, the contemporaneous stuff, nobody's talking about abortion in political science anyway. So, the contemporaneous was mostly, the Irish have party loyalty because the Democrats welcomed him into the machine, and, that sort of thing. But I do think, we have gotten a more nuanced view, going forward, recognizing, and the groups have changed, but, recognizing that, okay, there are some different asks, politically, that different denominations might have. And that, you really need to look in a much finer grained kind of way, because there are not, obviously, within kind of Protestantism, there are a lot of different sets of values, a lot of different sects, et cetera, that want different things. So, I will say sort of the main thing that pops up as a variable in sort of voter and public opinion analysis is sort of the Catholic versus Protestant versus Catholic versus mainline Protestant versus evangelical / born again, which, as I understand, theologically are not the same thing, but are used more or less interchangeably, in survey research. With the rare occasion, I mean, you can break out other groups, but in your typical survey, the sample size is so small that it's very hard to say anything about. I mean, and we have a fairly good sense of Jewish voters, but, Muslim voters, not so much. And beyond that, Pew actually did an amazing study of Muslims, just a public opinion study about 15 years ago now. And their initial to create a sample of like 1,200 Muslims to interview, they started by, I believe, making 1 million initial phone calls where the screener was just, are you Muslim or not? And then followed up with, the rest. So, we don't know so much about kind of the voting patterns of some of these others, but I think as probably most people that follow politics would understand, the big divide seems to be between sort of evangelical voters and everybody else. You also have to overlay race on top of that. So, kind of within the Catholic Church, white Catholics are actually pretty Republican these days, whereas Latino Catholics are not. On the other hand, if you look at kind of, that chunk of Latino voters that are...
but they've been moving more so in that direction, Latino Catholics.
Well, and also if you look at Latinos, some of that movement towards Republicans, there is sort of an evangelical community of Latinos that have left the Catholic Church. So that's, part of that story. So, these things intersect in all kinds of ways, and that's probably more than you ever wanted to hear with that simple question that you asked.
No, it's a good starting point.
And I will say, I think the other thing, and I don't think we maybe do as much with this from an empirical point as we can, because we don't maybe do as much with values, I think, as we ought to. And
no, it always frustrated me
and part
that
of,
we have divided the discipline.
There's a very small sort of literature on the psychology of values, but it just is kind of it's sort of underdeveloped a little bit. But I think that is sort of a nexus between sort of religion and other ideologies, or religion and politics. A mediator, if you will, is that, religion begets certain values, which beget certain political preferences. And I think not just, unpacking religious values, but I think just unpacking values is that step in the middle is one that I think political science has not done as much with as it ought to. I always have to be careful of, saying there are gaps because, there's stuff out there maybe I haven't seen, but I have not seen much, in looking at voter behavior, that kind of values, in between step, which I think a lot of people, if you talk to them in a more, open-ended setting, they do use kind of values-laden language or just talk about my values or, whatever.
Well, and we don't want to get too down like the methodological side, but part of that tends to be because as you note, when you do the more qualitative analysis, I'm thinking about the famous book, The Heart of Altruism, in social science research, which gets it tries, that would be one of those, attempting to hit some of that nexus that you're talking about. But of course, it's a qualitative work, and qualitative work has not typically been very effective among behavioralists.
To use a point of methodological importance, it's a giant pain in the ass in a lot of ways.
Oh,
as well.
It is.
So
Very much so. And one of the things, and if you want some brand new research on the Latino community and the Latina community as it relates to Catholicism, one of my students actually did for her senior work that is now getting published work, specifically looking at that community and having structured long form interviews with them to see how they'd moved to be more MAGA, which is what she discovered as she was doing it. Now, but to bring it a little bit from behavioralism to kind of the theory and history a little bit here, one of the things, it's almost embedded in Americanness, so it's worth pointing out so that we can observe it, is that liberalism, the first of the ideologies that we looked at, it has a very complicated relationship with religion, right? Its overall view is, let's say, it's agnostic in its kind of original position. And it's an American conception of liberalism, and you see this in Thomas Jefferson, for example, who thinks you're eventually going to kind of get to this melting pot of civic Christianity that's going to be a lot less dogmatic and better for everybody once you have a free market of ideas in a liberal system for religion. And so a lot of liberals take this they're not necessarily going to be anti-religion, or some of them deeply so, but at best they're going to be agnostic about it. And that hits kind of an early divide, whereas conservatives, we talked about them, they saw religion as being part of that long passed down tradition of understanding things that helps you make sense of the world that you ought not just to jettison. And so they were actually critical of liberals for not being more religious. And so one of the questions that we take on and we'll have to think about here together, Justin, is one of the defenses you have to make is religion a ideology, or is it more of a Lego piece add-on to an ideological set, right? And is it more compatible with certain ones and less compatible with others? And so there's an argument to be made that says, well, obviously we see a lot of conservatives who have religious backgrounds because those are more, that add-on set works with conservatism in a way that it doesn't work as neatly with when it comes to liberalism. What do you think about? I mean, again, obviously, we're eventually going to get to my view, which is that it can be an independent ideology. But I am curious about your take on that as well.
Yeah, well, I think some of it goes back to kind of the values part, that I was talking about earlier. That to the degree that religion informs your values, and for a lot of people it does. I think that is a chunk of a big chunk of it. I do think sort of contemporary conservatism, has very much kind of intertwined with religion. One in terms, like you were saying, of being that tradition. One of these traditions that we uphold. I think another is maybe tactical. A little bit. To step. It's also a group identity, and I always I always bristle a little bit or try to push back. When conservatives complain about, Democrats and identity politics. It's like, well, you do it too. It's just different groups, but you don't see them as groups because it's us, is sort of the
That's fair.
The story
That's fair.
there. So, I'm curious to hear your argument about how it's a separate identity, or a separate ideology, because I guess I'm agnostic on that, in some ways, depending on what it is, so I do think, it is kind of upstream of a lot of politics, and sensibly so, I mean, it's, it stands to reason that would be the case. On the other hand, I do think that there are some specific, the Doug Wilsons of the world and such, that have a very sort of Christian nationalist standpoint. That I think clearly is an ideology. I'm curious, kind of your take on maybe the in-betweens of that, because, I think Doug Wilson will burn me at the stake in the end is his end game, more or less.
Well, he'd probably burn me at the stake too, and I even
yeah.
But before we get to that, I actually have to pause and interrupt us because we've come to the end of our ad-supported preview. So this is part of our supporters exclusive midweek shows, and if you want to get that, you've got to become a supporter of the show. So if you head down to the show notes, you too can become a supporter of the show, and you can get all of our ideology conversations. But you can also get a lot more, like things like our access to our Discord group. Now, if you're not currently a supporter, but you'd be able to like to get the show because you're not in a financial position to do that, don't forget you can reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com and make that happen. However, right now, this week is the last week of a special that we are running. If you become a new supporter or you upgrade your level of support in July, you can either get 90% off for your first month. We make it free, but again, Patreon won't let us do that. Or you can get an additional 10% off for yearly supporters. So all you got to do is head down to the show notes. You're going to see the discount codes there. You put those in and you become a supporter of the Politics Guys. You can also head to politicsguys.com/support and put in the links from there. Again, don't forget to take those promo codes with you. Again, that's 0943D and 9B50C, but I highly encourage you to head down to the show notes. Finally, this is also the last week where if we have 25 new supporters or upgraded supporters, we'll start putting out video content for the first time on the Politics Guys, and we'll be able to answer that question, why can't I watch you on YouTube? And the answer will be, you'll be able to. You'll be able to see Justin gesture in July, as we were teasing about at the top of the show, and so much more. But again, you've got to become a supporter, and that will also unlock not just this show, but all of our previous ideology shows. It'll unlock the ongoing set of shows with Ken Katkin and myself, where we've been going through the Federalist Papers. We're about 1/8 of the way through. That's been a lot of fun, along with all the written content for that. Additionally, you can go back and get our whole Constitution shows and so much more. So again, become a supporter of the Politics Guys today and do it in July to make video podcasts possible. I finish up by giving a huge shout out to people who make this show possible, and they are our executive producers. And they are Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back with a full episode of this weekend, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.